John Walsh,
Yes, sir.
we have a pretty good topic today, don't we?
I think so.
This is one when we made that initial list of like the top topics that we wanted to cover when we first started the show. This was, I think, probably the first one you actually mentioned. We kind of randomized it. But this was like the one for you.
Yeah, I was excited about it. And it's a topic that's becoming more and more prevalent in politics and in science in general. And I thought, it might be interesting if we looked at each of the 50 states and find out what effects climate change is having on that particular state.
So we're going to be looking at 50 states of climate change today.
Exactly.
Nice. I like it.
Let's do it.
You're listening to It Might Be Interesting with your hosts, Josh Levy
And John Walsh.
Now, there's an endless amount of information out there on any given topic.
And sometimes you just need somebody who can extrapolate it in a way that might be interesting. So, Josh, before we dive right into it, you had stated when you sat down that you had found some research that irritated you to read it. Can you go over what that research is and what you found?
Yeah, I did. I'll say mixed feelings, irritated me, depressed me a little. But, there's like hope there too, room for opportunity and hope. But while doing research on the various states, I came across an article that is, it's actually titled "Environmentalists Tend to Have Bad Voting Records and Lie About It Too." And it basically says that over 90% of environmentalists, if you stop them on the street and even do a blind study where you're not getting their name and contact info, you're just asking anonymously, do you vote? And for the record, this, to clarify, this says environmentalist. This means this is used to describe anyone who has climate change at the top of the list. So whatever,
their political list?
Political list of priorities. So if they say it is a major factor in who they decide to vote for, and
90% of them are not showing up to the polls?
90% of them, over 90% of them immediately say without hesitation, they say, of course I do. And of course, and then they did some research based on, there's like post-voting, like polls and stuff and things that are done anonymously too. And when they come through, they actually found out 20% of them do vote.
So 90% claim that it's the most important. I'm confused, I guess.
So out of all environmentalists, 90% of them proclaim that they vote.
Oh, I see.
Yep, they'll say, of course I vote.
And only 2 out of 10 actually do.
Yes, 20%. So
wow.
Yeah, 4 out of 5 don't even vote. And it was shocking because, I also, and maybe this is a caricature in my head and I'm kind of over portraying, the type of person, but I do know several people who very much are the litter police, like I'll throw a plastic straw in the trash, not thinking, and oh my God, it's like, arrest him now, take him to court. And so when you see something like this, that's why I said kind of depressing, like deflating, like, really? You're not walking the walk?
I always hear this argument on like Fox News that, some scientists say blah, 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 right? But they never name a scientist. Right. And they never show you a case study done by a scientist. And they never show you peer-reviewed articles from scientists, because that's how science works, right? Some scientists might think the moon is made of cheese. But that does not make it science. What makes it science is, hey, we did these studies in our laboratory. We handed it over to our peers who duplicated those findings in their laboratories, and therefore the science is sound. But just saying, some people are in disagreement with it is not a valid argument to discredit all of the work that leads up to it. And it's not just federal agencies that are doing the science on this. It's state governments as well. And a lot of the data that I found is state related. So if you're ready, I think we should jump into it and look at what the states are finding.
Absolutely.
Let's do it. Well, Josh, I thought we would kick it off with Alabama. So the southeast region of the United States has seen an increase in rain by 27%. And this is creating a great deal of flooding within Alabama. There's rivers like the Tennessee River have dams on them, but there's a lot of little rivers that either they're not dammed or they have a dam that is incapable of holding back the the floodwaters. So we're seeing like the P River floods into Elba, and then the Alabama River has flooded Selma and Montgomery in the past as well. And we're going to see an increase in those temperatures that are driving the rain into Alabama.
So, I mean, what effects? So when you talk about all this flooding, this rain, and I think of a region, state like Alabama in that region, what kind of effects is that going to have on like crops, agriculture, something that is pretty key to that state?
So agriculture within the state is going to see, with increased rise in temperature, right now they have about 15 days per year that are above 95 degrees. By 2050, that should be around 30 to 60 days per year. That's going to wreak havoc on major crops such as corn, but most predominantly it's going to create heat stress among livestock who will have difficulty breeding due to reduced metabolism that is caused by that heat stress.
So I took a look at Illinois, and one thing that really stood out to me in this article was the research stating the rate of warming has markedly accelerated. So it's not just increased, it's increased exponentially. So between 1900 and 2010, the average Midwest air temperature increased by 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. But between 1950 and 2010, the average temperature increased twice as fast. And between 1980 and 2010, it increased 3 times as quickly as it did between 1900 and 2010. So we look at that and we see, okay, so the temperature has gone up 1.5 degree in 100 years. Big deal. That's 3 degrees Fahrenheit in 200 years. No, this is at the rate it's going, it'll be closer to 4 degrees by 2050.
So California is one of those states that has a lot of issues going on, from wildfires and extreme heat and so on. But the one area that grabbed my attention when doing a little research on it was the snowpack in the high country of California. That is where the majority of the water comes from that feeds their reservoirs. And as the temperatures rise, we're going to see less and less snow in that high country and more rain. And that is going to deplete those reservoirs as water just trickles off the mountain rather than being held and reserved there and then slowly melting.
So what's the end result, the expectation we have, or what can we expect to see with this transition from the snowfall to more rain?
What we're most likely expected to see as a result of that is the demand for water to go up and to just exponentially increase within California. Whether it's ranchers, whether it's people in recreational activities, or whether it's just for water for consumption. With more people moving to California and more people needing water to live in California, you're going to see a great deal more restrictions on water and a lot of policies aimed at around water security.
So I took a look at Colorado, which was very interesting because due to several factors, the altitude being landlocked, just a lot of geographic factors. The heat has increased the average temperature faster than the average expected, and the rest of the country. And it's, depending on the year, between second and third fastest rising temperatures in the country. The droughts are getting worse and worse, and agriculture, farming, ranching here in Colorado is a really big part of the economy, exports, and we've had just absolutely devastating wildfires. But one thing I did want to hop into was the snowpack. Just like you just mentioned with California, we're having much less snowpack. It'll affect everything from economic revenue, because fewer ski days in the year, which is a huge source of revenue. But more importantly, the Rocky Mountains. So for anyone who doesn't live in Colorado, this is what makes it so important. The Rocky Mountains and that snowpack provides downstream fresh water for 17 states and Mexico, part of Mexico.
Literally a trickle-down effect.
Yeah.
So if you live in New York, you're very accustomed to tropical cyclones. That they're infrequent, and they hit between like July and October. But more devastating is the nor'easters. A nor'easter is longer in duration, and they generally do not occur during the warmer months. They occur during winter. And because they're longer and they stretch out when they hit, they can cause flooding that does not go away.
How is this going to be felt by people who are right by the coast? There are a lot of people out there. How's it going to kind of hit them?
Yeah, the majority of New York's population is along the coast, so they're going to be the most impacted. A large fraction in New York City and Long Island and coastal areas, it's less than 10 feet above sea level, and it's extremely vulnerable to these nor'easters and the storm surges that come in. The current 100-year flood event can produce an 8.6 foot storm surge across these lower levels of New York.
So Louisiana was a really interesting state to research, because I got a lot of details on what the heck it means when people talk about a city sinking, or being completely overflooded and everything permanently. So what's happening in Louisiana, they have these wetlands and these marshlands right along the shores and everything, and they're made up of these sediments that are made up of and protected by like various types of algae and essentially sea life and plant life that helps keep and construct a shore, nature's barrier, essentially. But with climate change, a lot of the algae and the barriers that we have been just eroding, which have also eroded away those sediments. And so the best way to think of it is, if you took a bunch of dirt and started pouring it into a bathtub, the water is going to rise. Like we have this kind of barrier between the ocean and the shore, but that shore is like slipping in and essentially pouring sand into the water. So it's not like it's necessarily sinking as much as, in a weird way, both. Like it's losing landmass while just increasing the water level, the water table.
So that's what's happening like in New Orleans?
Well, I'm glad you bring that up. It's actually not New Orleans per se, or specifically. It's actually happening all around Louisiana and happening elsewhere and at greater risk elsewhere, because over the last 50 years, Louisiana, the effects of this has caused Louisiana to lose a landmass of wetland equivalent in area to the state of Delaware.
So Texas is having an event, or rather a phenomenon known as spring advancement. It's an event where you see the flowers are blooming earlier, mating seasons are happening earlier, and nesting is happening earlier. One study conducted on 670 some odd species that found that 62% of them were exhibiting signs of spring advancement. Now, the reason why this is disturbing is, let's say you have a bird or something that starts laying eggs earlier in the year. Well, the insects that bird eats may not be available when their eggs hatch. So it's going to start depleting those birds because they cannot feed their offspring.
Yeah. When you brought up Texas, I actually pulled up some information on the heat and particularly the drought that stood out. So right now, in 2019, Texas faces the worst threat in the country for summer drought in the entire country. But by 2050, Texas is projected to see an increase in the severity of drought by approximately 75%. So Nevada is a state that is definitely impacted, not just independently, but by surrounding states, because I found out if the surrounding states that provide water to Nevada, running to Lake Mead in Nevada, continue their current trends with increased temperatures, with lower snowpack each year. Lake Mead, which is currently 1,085 feet above sea level, will drop to 1,000 feet above sea level by 2020. And yes, 2020 next year. And the reason that would be absolutely devastating for Nevada is because as soon as it hits 1,000 feet, it would cut off most of the water supply for Las Vegas.
One of the largest effects in Florida can be seen. There's a lot of effects in Florida, but one of them is the coral reef. It stretches over 130 miles, and it's home to over 5,000 different marine species. As a result of climate change, we're seeing something called coral bleaching. This is where an increase in the water temperature of just 1 degree Fahrenheit results in extensive coral bleaching, which occurs and basically it kills the algae that is within the coral reef, and then therefore it kills the food for the coral reef, and then the life that depends upon the coral reef, the fish life, they die out as well. So we're seeing this happen throughout the coral reef in Florida with those warmer ocean temperatures.
The state of Oregon was part of an in-depth study by Nature Communications, and a nonprofit organization that does extensive data mapping based on findings. And what that means is they look at the current climate and everything with a certain region, and they compare it to what it will be 30 years from now, 50 years from now. So what they said was the state of Oregon, their climate, which now is very lush, they have mountain ranges there, snowpack, will look like the Central Californian Valley within 50 years. It'll be a desert, Central Californian desert.
One of the main effects in the state of Ohio is that we see warmer water trends within the Great Lakes that cause something called an algal bloom, which can, have unsightly effects on fish. It looks, disgusting on the water, and it can degrade the water quality. So I don't know if you recall, but in 2014, they had an algal bloom in Lake Erie, and the city of Toledo banned drinking water. So if you combine the increase in high temperature, which can cause dehydration and heat stroke, and then you can't drink the tap water on top of that, it's a compounding effect that the state of Ohio knows a little bit better than the surrounding areas.
Delaware is seeing an impact that many states in that region is, and that is shorter winters. Now, what these shorter winters and warmer winters means is a very common theme, commonly mentioned with climate change, is the mosquito season. So with a shorter winter and a warmer winter, there's a shorter hibernation, which means there is an increase in the number of mosquitoes because they have a longer breeding season. But what the reason this is so troubling for a lot of scientists and people in the medical field is because mosquitoes do still carry a lot of various diseases, and those diseases can be spread a lot wider, a lot faster, and will stay alive much longer. It's not like it'll be in one season and then all the mosquitoes go into hibernation, the disease dies off, and they start fresh. Like, it can last through multiple seasons, and this is facing several states in the Northeast.
So I'm sure anyone living in South Dakota would know that, like when I was a kid, you would see on the local news when hail got to the size of a golf ball, and now it's getting to the size of baseballs and softballs. And the people of South Dakota know this when they see this huge cumulonimbus coming across the plains, that it's, you can tell by the shape of these things whether or not they have hail in them. And hail is extremely destructive, and it doesn't get enough coverage in the news like hurricanes do. But hail can damage crops, it can kill livestock, it does billions of dollars in damage. State Farm Insurance claims that national hail damage is estimated to be around $2.4 billion a year. And of that, South Dakota, even though they're not the largest state for hail, it's becoming a larger problem there. And it's in the tens of millions of dollars in damage that it does every year. And so one of the things about hail that people don't talk about is it can create flash flooding because it acts as a dam, a natural dam. And when hail moves across the top of water and then it coagulates, it can stop on a curb or a tree or within a ditch or something and create a natural barrier or dam, which creates a lot of flash flooding.
In Rhode Island, this is one of the states that has already started to see coastal properties fall into the ocean, become unlivable. And what makes it particularly bad in a state like Rhode Island and other small coastal states is those beachfront properties and those ones close to the shore are a higher percentage of the homes than in places like New York, where there's a lot of land mass for other people to live away from the shore. And this means within the next 30 years, up to 1/3 of the entire state's budget will go towards repairing infrastructure that's getting damaged every single year. It's just going to be rinse and repeat, flushing that money down the toilet, repairing things that just keep getting broken because of how much of the state will be damaged due to rising sea levels and all the storms they anticipate.
A few weeks ago, I saw a video of this guy on a boat going up this river, and it was a very serene sort of, footage. And the river looked silver. It just looked like he was on Mercury, like floating on Mercury. And then I realized that the river had a bunch of upturned salmon in it. And he was literally riding the boat across tens of thousands of dead salmon. And this is a phenomenon that's happening in the state of Washington, where we see these salmon that come in from the ocean to go upriver to spawn are finding significantly warmer temperatures, and they're dying as a result of heat stroke by the tens of thousands of them. And there's so many salmon and different breeds of salmon within Washington that are now listed as endangered species by the federal government. And they're doing a lot of things to try to mitigate this, from farming salmon to looking at creating channels around dams that salmon can go up. But the impact that it's having is that the water temperature is such that they're getting exhausted before they even reach these dams. So it's a significant problem that's only increasing for the state of Washington.
I never thought that I would ever receive any news or information out of the state of Vermont that would scare me or concern me. This absolutely terrified me to my core. In Vermont, what happens, like in many other states, the water that gets to the people, the water for drinking water delivered to them, it comes through runoff. And based on the changes we've seen with climate change, combined with the development. So there's a lot of development, commercial development that takes away the river beds and trees that provide shade for the river water that comes down. Plus with the increase in the amount of water. So there's a lot of flooding, there's an increase. It isn't, the water is standing for a longer period of time before it gets to its eventual source. Let me just say that there are already several health officials in Vermont that have deemed places, various lakes and beautiful places where families go and swim, they have deemed them unsafe to swim because they have found certain bacteria in there. It only takes 24, 48 hours for something like this bacteria to start building up in that water supply.
So for North Carolina, one of the things that is changing is the quality of the air. And air pollution can cause heart and lung problems. We see this predominantly in people that already have respiratory issues, but also older adults and children, infants particularly. It creates a dysfunction in the breathing within the lungs and how they operate. We see decreased lung function, asthma, chronic bronchitis, irregular heartbeats, heart attacks, and even early death among a lot of these individuals. So as the temperatures rise and pollution gets worse, we're going to continue to see, and North Carolina especially is going to continue to see a lot of expenditure going into fighting respiratory illness.
So in Maryland, they have experienced climate change as well, being at sea level. They have already started to see the impact of rising sea levels, as well as just getting hammered by hurricane after hurricane, stronger every year, and it's affected their agriculture, but also their fishing industry. There are places in the region that are big into fishing. Their economy thrives and depends on it. But the problem is, because of the pollution in the water as well, the fish that are coming up, that they're catching, let's just say aren't the best quality fish to put on the market. In fact, a lot of them have to be just tossed aside because they're just filled with plastic pollutant. These fish are just so sickly, and it is slowly making the yields for the fishermen when they go out every time. It's making the yields lower, so they're making less money, impacting the economy. But not just that, it is making it more dangerous for them to go out there. And this is a lot of people, a good portion of that population there, because of how, the fishing to Maryland is like coal is to West Virginia. Like, that is the heart of it.
So in North Dakota, with the warmer temperatures, you're going to see an increase in precipitation. 2011 was one of the wettest years on record. We saw the Sioux River near Minnow crested at 4 feet above its record. And then the Red River watershed, river flows during the worst flood year, have been increasing about 10% each decade since the 1920s. So North Dakota can expect continual flooding and can expect higher levels of rainfall as a result of climate change.
So we've probably heard of instances where we have taken it too far, and in some cases the effects cannot be undone. We cannot turn back, and this is actually unfortunately true in parts of Connecticut. where, according to climatecentral.org, that does all the research alongside government organizations, the majority of, roughly 55% of homes and counties and towns in Connecticut have already accumulated more than enough greenhouse gases and emissions in their atmosphere for future sea level rise to where they're toast. Within the next, 50 to 100 years, some will be in the next 10, some will be 50 years from now, but there are ones where the existing emissions have essentially guaranteed the sea level will eventually take them out no matter what we do today.
So one of the 17 states you had mentioned that benefits from water coming off the Rocky Mountains is the state of New Mexico. They have water that runs down the surface and feeds into reservoirs all the way down into what they call the Elephant Butte, and the increase in temperatures is not only affecting the amount of water that's flowing down to them, it's affecting the moisture that's in the soil. So the soil is hardening and the water is running off of it faster, and it fuels the water leaving the state, and this is leading to a drier climate for brush and for trees. And if you've been to New Mexico, there's a lot of brush there, and these brush fires can spread extremely fast, and there's no real moisture either in the vegetation or the soil to help bring down the rate at which it spread.
So when it comes to some of the downstream ripple effects that these storms can have, climate change creating these storms is a fun fact here I found about New Jersey. When Hurricane Sandy hit, New Jersey had 5.1 billion gallons, 5.1 billion with a B, gallons of sewage overflow. And that's actually, I know you might think, first impression is, yeah, that's kind of gross, which it is, but that actually has some very serious health implication. I mean, where it can get into certain water supplies affecting wildlife. So the cleanup efforts, so to speak, are ones that could take much, much longer, and you have the health effects of something like 5 billion gallons of overflowing untreated sewage with each storm, and every year we're seeing a bigger and bigger storm.
So the northern part of Alaska is filled with permafrost, and if you're unfamiliar what permafrost is, it is permanently frozen ground, and it is ground that has trapped vegetation and animal life in it from millions of years ago that hasn't fully decompressed or decomposed rather. And as it thaws, then it starts to decompose, and that lets off methane and carbon dioxide. Methane is 20 times more potent in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. The only advantage, if there is one, is that it doesn't stay in the atmosphere as long as carbon dioxide does. And they estimate that the permafrost melting both in Alaska, Canada, and Russia is going to contribute to about 1.7 degrees of increased temperature Fahrenheit globally. That said, temperatures within the permafrost, they have drilled down 65 feet. A team of researchers have been up there looking at the temperatures within the permafrost itself. And 65 feet down, they're noticing a 3-degree increase in temperatures in the permafrost alone. And if you live in Alaska or in northern Alaska, one of the things that this can wreak havoc on is infrastructure, because as that permafrost melts, it sinks. And if your house is built on that, it is no longer standing because it just drops by, 10 feet because the permafrost just knocked it out from underneath it.
In Indiana, one of those states where agriculture is absolutely paramount to the success, the survival, and thriving economy of Indiana. They have seen an increase in sporadic rains. So instead of more predictable, steady rainfalls that actually help the crops, it's more sporadic but hard torrential downpour that causes more flooding-like conditions rather than helping the crops. But what even more so than that, what's going to affect agriculture is the current number of extremely hot days with temperatures over 95 degrees will rise significantly because it's currently at about 7 days per year. But within the next 30 years, the region is projected to go from 7 days a year of 95 degrees or up to around 51 days per year.
One of the effects that climate change is having on South Carolina is as you increase carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and simultaneously you're cutting down trees throughout the planet, the ocean will absorb that carbon dioxide instead, and that warms up the ocean and it affects the wildlife, or rather the fish life that is in there, and then that affects economies and food sources. South Carolina is going to see a decrease in some of its favorite foods, such as oysters and scallops, and carbon that is getting absorbed into that is also affecting as these storm surges hit land, it's mixing that salt water with a lot of the marshes around there. So in South Carolina, rising sea and saltwater intrusion into these freshwater wetlands is going to spell trouble for clams, mussels, oysters, as well as birds like egrets and endangered wood storks. So Josh, if I did my math right, that puts us at 25 states. That's the halfway mark. What are your thoughts so far?
Yeah, I noticed that the neat thing was we were able to find a lot of effects that are significant that aren't really talked about much, pertaining to a region, but also how interconnected they are. If you live anywhere south of Colorado, the rainfall, the snow pack matters in the Rocky Mountains, things like that, how interconnected it is. And I know we've already started doing research on the next 25 states, and I'm really excited because for anyone listening, once you hear the next 25 states, you're gonna see it even more deeply connected, and the effects across the board for everyone.
Yeah, because climate change doesn't stop at a man-made border. So I'm looking forward to covering those other 25 states and how that affects us on both a regional level and a national level. You've been listening to It Might Be Interesting. Please join us next time.
And we'd love to hear any thoughts, questions, feedback, and even episode suggestions you might have. So if you do have any, please send it over to thoughts@itmightbeinteresting.com. And you can also check out our other episodes at itmightbeinteresting.com.